You wake up on a bed of straw. The air is thick, smoky, damp. There is a dog pressed against your leg. A goat somewhere behind you makes a sound you can barely hear over the crackle of a small fire burning in the middle of a dirt floor. There are no windows. There is no chimney. The smoke from the fire drifts upward and seeps through the thatched roof above your head, and this is your home. This is not a ruin. This is not a shelter someone built in desperation. This is a normal house, lived in by a normal family in the year 1100. For most of the medieval period, the vast majority of people in Europe lived in homes that would shock you. Not because they were falling apart, but because they were never built to last. They were built to be replaced. If you were a peasant in medieval England, your home was probably a long, narrow structure made from materials you could find within walking distance. The frame was timber, rough-cut wooden posts driven into the ground or set into simple foundation trenches. The walls were wattle and daub. Wattle meant a lattice of thin wooden sticks woven between upright stakes. Daub meant a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung, and water packed over that lattice and left to dry. The roof was thatch, bundles of reeds or wheat straw layered thick enough to shed rain, but thin enough that smoke could escape through it. There were no nails, no glass, no plumbing, no chimney, not for you, not for centuries. The floor was beaten earth, sometimes packed hard, sometimes layered with rushes, dried grasses and herbs scattered across the ground to absorb moisture, crumbs, and waste. The Venerable Bede, an English monk writing in the early 700s, recorded that people used rushes for floors, and the practice continued for hundreds of years after. You did not sweep your floor every day. You added new rushes on top of the old ones. Underneath, layers of decomposing straw, food scraps, and whatever else fell to the ground slowly built up. The smell, especially in warm weather, was constant. Your house had one room, one space. You slept here, you cooked here, you ate here. Your animals, a pig, a goat, chickens, maybe an ox, often slept here too, either inside the same structure or in a connected lean-to. This was not neglect, this was practical. Your animals were your wealth. You protected them the same way you protected your children, by keeping them close. In 1950, archaeologists began excavating a site in the Yorkshire wolds of northern England called Warham-Percy. It was a medieval village that had been abandoned sometime in the late 1500s. What they found beneath the surface was a detailed record of how peasant houses were built, rebuilt, and modified over centuries. The houses at Warham-Percy were not permanent structures. They were rebuilt every generation or two. Timber rotted. Walls crumbled. Families did not repair, they rebuilt. The entire framework of a peasant house might last 30 or 40 years before being dismantled and reassembled nearby using whatever old timber could be salvaged and new materials cut from the surrounding landscape. This meant your home was always slightly different from your parents' home, slightly larger or smaller, a few feet to the left or right, a different angle to catch less wind. Medieval housing was not architecture, it was adaptation. Now look up, above you is the Lord's house, and it is nothing like yours. If you were a minor noble or a wealthy landowner, your home was built around a great hall. This was a large rectangular room, sometimes 40 or 50 feet long, with high walls of timber or stone, a raised wooden floor at one end for the Lord's family, and a long trestle table where meals were eaten, business was conducted, and disputes were settled. The hall was the center of power. Visitors were received here. Justice was administered here. At night, servants and retainers slept on the floor around the dying fire, while the lord and his family retired to a private chamber called a solar, a smaller room at the upper end of the hall, often slightly elevated, with its own fireplace and sometimes actual glass windows. Glass, in a world where most people had no windows at all, the presence of glass marked you as wealthy beyond measure. The cost of a single glass window in the 13th century could equal the annual income of a small farm. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086 and completed in record time by teams of royal commissioners traveling across England, gives us one of the most detailed snapshots of medieval housing ever compiled. It recorded not just land ownership, but the physical infrastructure of hundreds of settlements, mills, churches, ploughlands, livestock, and habitations. What the Domesday Commissioners found was that the vast majority of English homes were modest. A typical peasant holding included a house, a small yard, and strips of open-field farmland. Some entries are brutally brief, a few words indicating a household with little or no livestock and no mill. These were families living on the edge. Their homes reflected that. Now move into town. If you were a medieval urban dweller, a craftsman, a shopkeeper, a laborer in London, Paris, or Cologne, your house was different again. Urban plots were narrow and deep because street frontage was valuable. You might live in a timber-framed house 2 or 3 stories tall with your shop or workshop on the ground floor and your living quarters above. The upper stories often jutted out over the street below, each floor slightly wider than the one beneath it. This was not aesthetic. This was structural. Building outward at each level allowed you to maximize interior space without expanding your foundation, which was limited by the width of your lot. Archaeological excavations in London's waterfront district, particularly along the Thames, have uncovered layers of medieval building foundations showing how densely packed urban housing became by the 13th and 14th centuries. Rooms were small. Stairs were steep. Light came from narrow, unglazed openings that you could cover with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. Ventilation was poor. Fire risk was extreme. Entire neighborhoods burned and were rebuilt repeatedly. Medieval cities burned regularly, sometimes losing a third of their buildings in a single event. There was a shift, slowly. Between roughly 1100 and 1400, housing across Europe began to change. Stone replaced timber for wealthier households. Chimneys appeared not just in castles but in prosperous merchant homes. The historian Jean Gimpel, in his book The Medieval Machine, argued that the spread of chimney technology was one of the quiet revolutions of the medieval period. Before chimneys, every fire filled the room with smoke and you breathed it all day. Chimneys channeled smoke upward and out. This sounds trivial. It was not. Smoke inhalation was a chronic health problem for medieval families. Studies of preserved medieval skeletons, including those analyzed from the Warham-Percy site, show evidence of respiratory stress consistent with long-term indoor smoke exposure. Your lungs knew what kind of house you lived in. Floors changed too. Earth floors gave way to stone flags in wealthier homes. Rushes gave way to woven mats and eventually rugs imported through expanding trade networks. Windows grew larger. Glass became slightly more available, though still a luxury. By the late medieval period, a prosperous yeoman family might live in a house with multiple rooms, a separate kitchen, and actual beds with frames and straw mattresses. This was the medieval equivalent of moving up in the world. But for the poorest families, the ones at the bottom of the social ladder, housing remained what it had always been. One room, smoke and straw, animals inside, cold in winter, wet when it rained. The English poet William Langland, writing in the 14th century in Piers Plowman, described the life of a laboring family with a directness that still stings, sleeping on straw, eating simple bread, waking before dawn to work land they did not own. Their homes were not described as beautiful, they were described as bare. Here is what you need to understand. Medieval people did not think of their homes the way you do. Your home is your private space, your retreat, your identity. A medieval peasant's home was a workspace, a shelter, a thing that wore out and was replaced. There was no property market, no mortgage, no real estate. The land belonged to the Lord. You had the right to use it, to build on it, to farm it, but always under conditions set by someone above you. Your house was not your castle. Your Lord's castle was your Lord's castle. Your house was a temporary structure built on borrowed ground. And yet people made them theirs. Archaeological evidence from Warham-Percy and other medieval sites shows that peasant families decorated their homes with small carved objects, tokens, and domestic items that suggest attachment, not indifference. A child's toy, a carved bone spoon, a piece of jewelry lost in the floor rushes. These were people who lived in fragile homes and still made them mean something. You live in a house today with insulation and running water and windows you can open. You choose the color of your walls. You hang pictures. You complain about the rent. But the walls around you right now are the product of 1,000 years of people figuring out how to keep the rain off, the smoke out, and the cold from killing them. Every chimney you see is a medieval invention. Every separate room you sleep in is a luxury that most humans never had. Your home is not normal. It is the exception. And it was built on top of the fragile, smoky, dung-walled houses of people who never imagined you would live like this. You wake up on a bed of straw. The air is thick. A goat presses against your leg, and this is the most advanced shelter your world has ever known.